The start of the offensive, 16th of April, 1945. By early 1945, the Allies had successfully liberated much of Western Europe, while the Soviet Union had pushed the German forces back on the Eastern Front, recapturing territories that were occupied since the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Before the start of the Battle of Berlin, the Soviets had already reached the Oder River, less than 60 miles from Berlin, by January 1945. Over the next few months, they consolidated their forces and prepared for the final push into the German capital. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front was positioned in the north, and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front was in the south, both poised for the assault on Berlin. On the German side, the defense was led by General Gotthard Heinrichi and the recently appointed city commander, General Helmuth Rehmann. However, the city was poorly prepared for an attack, and the troops defending it were a mix of poorly trained Volkssturm militia units, anti-aircraft units, and some combat-hardened Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht divisions. On the 16th of April, 1945, the Soviets launched the offensive with a massive artillery barrage targeting German defenses, marking the beginning of the Battle of Berlin. It started with the Battle of the Seelow Heights, where the Soviets had to overcome the last major defensive line before the city's outskirts. Despite the desperate resistance of the German forces, the overwhelming numbers and superior resources of the Soviets gradually pushed them back, allowing the Soviets to advance closer to the city's perimeter. This marked the start of one of the most brutal battles of World War II and the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Soviet onslaught, with their aim of taking Berlin and ending the war, was relentless, setting the stage for the subsequent encirclement and final assault on Berlin. The encirclement of Berlin, the 25th of April, 1945. After the initial Soviet offensive from the 16th to the 19th of April, 1945, that broke through the Germans' defensive line at the Seelow Heights, the Soviets were well positioned to advance towards Berlin. Their next objective was to surround and isolate the city, preventing any potential German reinforcements from arriving and denying any escape route for those trapped within the city. On the 20th of April, Adolf Hitler's birthday, the 1st Belarusian Front of Marshal Zhukov and the 1st Ukrainian Front of Marshal Konev had advanced to the outskirts of Berlin. By the 24th of April, they were closing in on the city center from the south, east, and north, while the Western Allies halted their advance on the River Elbe to the west, in accordance with previously agreed-upon territorial divisions. This encirclement effectively isolated the German capital, cutting off over 450,000 German troops that were defending the city. Despite the hopelessness of the situation, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi leadership refused to surrender, insisting that the city would be defended to the last man. Hitler appointed General Helmuth Weidling as the commander of the Berlin defense area, responsible for the city's defense. The encirclement of Berlin not only trapped the German military units in the city, but also the remaining civilian population. As the Soviet forces tightened their grip, the German forces began preparing for the inevitable Soviet assault on the city, while civilians sought shelter wherever they could find it. The stage was set for the third phase of the Battle of Berlin, the bitter and destructive street-by-street and building-by-building urban combat that would characterize the battle for the city center. The battle in the city, the 26th of April, the 2nd of May, 1945. On April 26, 1945, the Soviet forces led by Marshals Zhukov and Konev started to advance into the city, marking the beginning of a brutal week-long street battle. Berlin's defense was a desperate effort led by General Weidling, commanding a mix of poorly trained Volkssturm militia, Hitler Youth, and remaining Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht units. They were vastly outnumbered and outgunned by the Soviet forces, but the defenders took advantage of the city's urban landscape, turning each street, building, and rubble pile into a potential defensive position. The Soviets had to clear out these pockets of resistance one by one. The fighting was intense and brutal, with high casualties on both sides. Buildings had to be cleared room by room in intense close-quarters combat. The city, already damaged by years of bombing, was further devastated. Fall of the Reichstag, the 30th of April, 1945. The fall of the Reichstag, the German parliament building, was a pivotal moment in the Battle of Berlin and symbolically marked the end of Nazi Germany. By April 30th, 1945, the Soviets had fought their way through the city of Berlin and reached the Reichstag. Despite being heavily damaged and partially burned from a fire in 1933, the Reichstag remained a potent symbol of Germany. Capturing it was of significant symbolic importance for the Soviets, representing the final defeat of Nazi Germany. The assault on the Reichstag was ferocious. The German defenders, including SS troops, soldiers, Hitler Youth, and Volkssturm militia, fought tenaciously, making the Soviets pay dearly for every room and corridor. They used every means at their disposal, turning the ruined parliament building into a fortress. After hours of intense close-quarter combat, Soviet soldiers managed to fight their way into the Reichstag's interior and reach the roof. In the evening, they hoisted the Soviet flag over the Reichstag, marking a symbolic victory. This iconic moment, captured in the famous photograph "Raising a Flag Over the Reichstag" by Yevgeny Kaldai, became one of the most recognized images of World War II. However, the hoisting of the flag didn't mark the end of the fighting. Fierce resistance in parts of the building continued into the night and over the next few days in other parts of the city. Coincidentally, as the Soviets were capturing the Reichstag, Adolf Hitler and his newly wedded wife Eva Braun committed suicide in the Führerbunker, a reinforced concrete shelter located a short distance away from the Reichstag. Hitler's death effectively signaled the end of the Third Reich, which had started with his appointment as German Chancellor in January 1933. The fall of the Reichstag thus symbolized the collapse of Nazi Germany. The German surrender, the 2nd of May, 1945. Despite the fall of the Reichstag and Hitler's suicide on the 30th of April, 1945, fighting in Berlin continued for a couple more days, as remnants of German units and scattered resistance pockets refused to surrender. General Helmut Weidling, the commander of the Berlin defense area, continued to coordinate the defense of the city. However, the situation was becoming increasingly untenable for the German defenders. They were vastly outnumbered, outgunned, and lacked any feasible means of reversing the situation. The city was in ruins, and the civilian population was caught in the crossfire, suffering immense hardships. On the 1st of May, Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had been appointed by Hitler as his successor in his political testament, made a radio announcement confirming Hitler's death and urging the German armed forces to continue the fight. Despite this, it was becoming evident to Weidling and the German High Command that further resistance was pointless and would only result in more needless loss of life. On the morning of the 2nd of May, General Weidling finally made the decision to surrender. He sent a representative carrying a white flag to the Soviet command post in the Tempelhof district of Berlin to negotiate terms. Weidling agreed to an unconditional surrender and ordered all remaining German forces in Berlin to cease hostilities. Later that day, Weidling broadcast a radio message to the city stating, "Every German soldier is to cease fighting immediately." By the afternoon, the guns finally fell silent in Berlin, and the Battle of Berlin was over. The German surrender marked the end of one of the most intense battles of World War II. Berlin was left devastated, with vast portions of the city reduced to rubble. The Soviet victory marked the final downfall of Nazi Germany, paving the way for the end of World War II in Europe. The German surrender in Berlin was followed a few days later by the overall unconditional surrender of all German forces, known as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, on the 8th of May, 1945.